The cold wind cut through Marcus's thin hoodie like a knife. He clenched his fists in his pockets, trying to hold on to the little warmth he had left. As he hurried down the nearly deserted street, his eyes landed on an old man huddled against a brick wall, shivering uncontrollably. Something in the man's hollow eyes stopped Marcus in his tracks. The pain, the exhaustion, it was a look of quiet surrender. For a moment, Marcus hesitated. He barely had enough to get by himself. His mom worked double shifts just to put food on the table, and winter was only getting started. He needed his jacket, but he couldn't walk away. His heart pounded as he unzipped his only jacket and draped it over the old man's trembling shoulders. "You need this more than I do," he murmured, ignoring the icy wind hitting his chest. The old man looked up at him, his eyes filling with tears. "Bless you, son," he whispered. Marcus forced a small smile and walked away, hugging his arms around himself against the biting cold. He had no idea that this one act of kindness would change everything. The biting Detroit wind cut through Marcus's thin hoodie like shards of glass, creeping into his bones as he walked down the cracked sidewalk. The sky had already turned dark, streetlights flickering as a few weary souls hurried home, their heads bowed against the bitter air. 16-year-old Marcus pulled his hood tighter over his head, his breath coming out in thin white clouds. His shoes, worn from too many winters, barely shielded his toes from the freezing pavement. But he kept walking, his pace steady, his mind occupied with numbers. Rent was coming up. His mother, Olivia, had already pulled extra shifts at the diner, her exhaustion more evident each night. The bills stacked on their tiny kitchen table never seemed to shrink. Every penny counted, and tonight's small job, shoveling snow from Mrs. Gordon's walkway, added a little more to what they needed. It wasn't much, but it was something. Marcus shoved his hands deep into his pockets, flexing his fingers to keep them from going numb. The cold seeped through his hoodie, but he was used to it. Winter in Detroit had always been unforgiving. He passed by the old laundromat, the one with the flickering neon sign. Just a few more blocks, and he'd be home, warm, safe, maybe even a hot meal waiting if his mom had time to cook. Then he saw him. An old man sat huddled against the brick wall of an abandoned storefront, arms wrapped around his knees. His clothes were tattered, barely more than rags, and his lips had taken on a bluish tint. His body trembled, shivering uncontrollably, as if his bones had forgotten warmth ever existed. Marcus slowed his steps. People passed by, glancing at the old man for only a second before looking away, pretending not to see him. A couple of well-dressed men walked past, their heavy winter coats drawn tight, but they didn't stop. Marcus stood there, his heart pounding against his ribs. He had walked these streets his whole life. He had seen people like this before, homeless, forgotten, just trying to survive. His mother had always taught him to be kind, but kindness wasn't something they had much room for lately. They could barely afford to take care of themselves. Still, something about this man, the way he sat, curled in on himself, as if waiting for the cold to swallow him whole, made it impossible for Marcus to keep walking. He stepped closer, clearing his throat. "Hey, sir, you okay?" The old man lifted his head slowly, his eyes glassy and distant. His face was weathered, deep lines etched into his skin, and his cheeks were hollow. Marcus dug into his pocket, pulling out the small amount of cash he had made that day. He crouched down, holding it out. "Here, maybe you can get something warm to eat." The old man didn't move. His eyes flickered to the money, then back to Marcus. He shook his head slowly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Keep it, son. You need it more than me." Marcus blinked. The man's hands, thin, skeletal, clutched his arms as if he was trying to hold himself together. The wind howled, rattling the broken window panes above them. Money wouldn't help. Not really. Marcus looked down at his own jacket. It wasn't much, just a faded old coat with a fraying collar. But it was warm. His mother would kill him. Winter was just starting, and this was the only jacket he had. He hesitated. The street around him felt quiet, like the world had slowed down, waiting for his decision. He could hear his mother's voice in his head, the worry she always carried, the constant reminders to be careful, to stay warm. Marcus exhaled sharply. "Here!" He unzipped his jacket and pulled it off, shivering as the wind hit his chest. He leaned down, gently draping it over the old man's shoulders. "You need this more than I do." The man's eyes widened. His lips trembled, but no words came out. He reached up with shaking hands, gripping the fabric as if afraid it might disappear. Marcus forced a smile. "It's okay. Stay warm, all right?" The old man's eyes filled with tears. "Bless you, son," he whispered. Marcus swallowed hard. The wind stung at his exposed skin, but he ignored it. He gave the old man one last nod before standing up and walking away, his arms wrapped tightly around himself. His fingers were numb by the time he reached his apartment building. The broken heater in the hallway didn't offer much relief, and he fumbled with the doorknob, his hands barely responding. When he finally stepped inside, warmth, however faint, washed over him. His mother stood at the kitchen counter, her apron still on from her shift at the diner. She turned as he entered, her brow furrowing. "Marcus, where's your jacket?" He tried to brush it off, shrugging as he set his backpack down. "I gave it to someone who needed it more." Silence. Her lips parted, her expression a mix of shock and something else, something unreadable. She wiped her hands on a dish towel, stepping closer. "You gave away your only jacket?" Marcus hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah, he was freezing, Mom. I couldn't just walk away." His mother sighed, pressing a hand to her forehead. "Baby, it's winter. You need to stay warm. You can't just—" She stopped, exhaling slowly. For a long moment, she just looked at him. Then, to his surprise, she smiled, soft and tired, but full of pride. She reached for the blanket draped over the couch, wrapping it around his shoulders. "You've got the biggest heart, Marcus," she murmured, pulling him into a hug. "But next time, at least tell me first." Marcus let out a small chuckle, despite his chattering teeth. "I'll keep that in mind." She shook her head, sighing. "Come on, let's get you warmed up." She guided him to the couch, rubbing his arms to chase away the cold. The apartment was still drafty, and he knew sleeping without his jacket was going to be rough. But as he sipped the cup of tea she handed him, warmth slowly creeping back into his fingers, he realized something. For the first time in a long time, he didn't just feel the cold. He felt something deeper, something warmer. And he had no idea that this one act of kindness was about to change his life forever. Morning came too soon. Marcus stirred beneath the thin blankets, his body aching, his throat raw. The cold had crept into his bones overnight, settling in like an uninvited guest. He groaned, blinking up at the ceiling, trying to will away the chills that ran down his spine. His mother's voice drifted from the kitchen. "Marcus, you up? Breakfast is ready." He forced himself to sit up, rubbing his face. His head throbbed, and his nose felt stuffed, but he didn't have time to be sick. School wasn't optional, not when he was already struggling to keep up. Missing even one day of math would put him behind, and he couldn't afford that. Dragging himself out of bed, he grabbed the hoodie his mom had given him the night before. Thin, worn at the cuffs, barely a shield against the winter air. He knew it wouldn't do much, but it was all he had now. In the kitchen, his mom was flipping eggs, her expression softening when she saw him. "You don't look great, baby. You sure you don't want to stay home today?" "I'm fine," Marcus mumbled, though his scratchy throat betrayed him. His mom handed him a cup of tea, her eyes filled with worry. "At least drink this before you go." He wrapped his fingers around the warm mug, letting the heat seep into his skin. "Thanks, Mom." She sighed, shaking her head. Still can't believe you gave away your jacket in the middle of winter. Marcus took a slow sip, the warmth soothing his throat. He needed it more. Her lips pressed into a thin line, but she didn't argue. Instead, she reached into the hall closet, rummaging through the pile of old clothes before pulling out an oversized hoodie. "It's not much, but at least it's something extra," she said, handing it to him. He took it, pulling it on over the other. It helped a little, but not much. "Stay warm, all right?" she said, as he grabbed his backpack and headed toward the door. "I will," he promised, stepping outside into the biting cold. The walk to school was brutal. The wind cut straight through the layers he had, sending sharp chills down his spine. He hunched his shoulders, tucking his hands into his hoodie pockets, but it wasn't enough. By the time he reached the school doors, his fingers were stiff, his nose red, and his teeth chattering. Inside, the warmth of the hallways hit him like a wave, but it didn't chase away the cold that had already settled deep inside. As he walked to his locker, he could feel eyes on him. People noticed. "Yo, Marcus, where's your coat?" He turned to see Ryan, one of the few friends he had at school, staring at him with a raised brow. Ryan was bundled up in a thick winter jacket, a scarf wrapped around his neck. Marcus forced a shrug. "Gave it away." Ryan frowned. "What? Why?" "There was this old guy on the street. He was freezing." Marcus hesitated, then added, "I couldn't just walk by." Ryan stared at him for a moment, then sighed, pulling off his scarf. "Man, you're gonna freeze. Here, take this." Marcus hesitated, but Ryan shoved the scarf into his hands. "Seriously, you need it more than me." "Thanks, man," Marcus said, wrapping it around his neck. It was thick, soft, and immediately cut some of the cold still lingering in his bones. As he turned back to his locker, a voice called out from behind him. "You gave away your jacket?" Marcus looked over his shoulder to see Sophie, a girl from his history class, standing nearby. She was holding a pair of knitted gloves in her hands. Marcus nodded, suddenly feeling self-conscious. "Yeah, he needed it more." Sophie's eyes softened. "That's really kind of you." She stepped forward, pressing the gloves into his hands. "Here, they're my brother's, but he never wears them. You should have them." Marcus swallowed, his fingers brushing over the warm fabric. "You don't have to." "I know," she said, offering a small smile. "But I want to." He hesitated, then slid the gloves on. They were a little big, but they were warm. "Thanks, Sophie." She nodded. "Just try to stay warm, okay?" "I will," he said, though he wasn't entirely sure how true that was. The morning dragged on. Math class was torture. Marcus's head was heavy, his body sluggish. The chill from earlier refused to leave, sinking into his muscles. Every time the classroom door opened, a rush of cold air sent shivers down his spine. By lunchtime, his throat ached and his energy was running low. He found a quiet corner of the cafeteria, pulling out the small sandwich his mom had packed. As he took a bite, Ryan plopped down across from him. "You seriously okay, man?" Ryan asked, watching him closely. "Yeah," Marcus mumbled. It's tired." Ryan shook his head. "You're gonna get sick." Marcus didn't respond. He just took another slow bite, trying to ignore the exhaustion weighing on him. Halfway through lunch, Sophie appeared, sitting down beside him. "I saw you checking the alley on the way in this morning," she said. "Were you looking for the old man?" Marcus glanced up, surprised she had noticed. "Yeah," he admitted, "but he wasn't there." Sophie frowned. "You think he's okay?" "I don't know," Marcus exhaled. I hope he found somewhere warm." Ryan leaned back in his chair. "Man, I don't know how you do it. Most people wouldn't have even stopped." Marcus shrugged, stirring the last bits of his sandwich around his tray. "It just felt like the right thing to do." Sophie smiled. "Well, it was. And for what it's worth, I think it says a lot about you." Marcus looked away, feeling heat rise to his cheeks despite the cold. He wasn't used to people noticing him like this. The rest of the day dragged. By the time the final bell rang, Marcus was running on fumes. His head pounded, his throat was raw, and his body ached with exhaustion. As he stepped outside, the cold hit him like a slap. The scarf and gloves helped, but without a proper jacket, the wind cut straight through his layers. He hunched his shoulders, walking quickly, eager to get home. As he passed by the alley again, he slowed, glancing toward the spot where the old man had been. Empty. The crumbling brick wall was bare. The only evidence that anyone had ever been there was a pile of disturbed snow where he had sat. Marcus stood there for a moment, his breath fogging in the air. Was he okay? Had someone helped him? Or had he simply disappeared into the night, another ghost swallowed by the cold? His chest tightened. There was nothing more he could do. With a sigh, Marcus turned away, shoving his hands deeper into his pockets as he continued walking. His body ached, his mind was heavy, and the cold felt sharper than ever. But he told himself one thing, over and over, like a silent prayer. I hope he's okay. The cold clung to Marcus like a second skin as he trudged down the street toward his apartment. The walk home felt longer than usual, his body weighed down by exhaustion. His head pounded, his throat ached, and his hands, despite the gloves Sophie had given him, felt stiff and numb. He just needed warmth. A hot cup of tea, a blanket, anything to chase away the chill that had burrowed deep into his bones. As he turned onto his block, something unusual caught his eye. A sleek black limousine was parked in front of his apartment building. Marcus slowed his steps, confusion knitting his brow. Limousines didn't come to this part of town. Not unless someone was lost or making a very bad decision. He hesitated for a moment, staring at the car. The polished exterior gleamed under the streetlights, its tinted windows revealing nothing. And then, as if sensing his presence, the back door opened. A man in a dark suit stepped out, his posture straight, his expression unreadable. His overcoat was thick, clearly expensive, and the leather gloves on his hands looked like they cost more than Marcus's rent. The man turned his gaze to Marcus, his lips curving into a polite smile. "Marcus Carter?" he asked, his voice deep and smooth. Marcus's stomach flipped. He didn't know this man. Didn't know why a guy in a limousine knew his name. Yeah?" Marcus answered hesitantly. The man's smile widened slightly. "I've been looking for you." Marcus stiffened. "Why?" The man stepped forward, his polished shoes barely making a sound on the pavement. "I represent someone you helped recently," he said, his tone calm but purposeful. "And he wanted to make sure you knew just how much your kindness meant." Marcus's breath caught in his throat. His mind raced, trying to make sense of the words. Someone he helped? There was only one person that could be. "The old man," Marcus murmured. The suited man nodded. "Yes." Relief, confusion, and something else, something he couldn't name, washed over Marcus. He had worried all day about what had happened to the man, but he never expected this. "He's okay?" Marcus asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The man's expression softened slightly. "He's more than okay thanks to you." Marcus swallowed hard. He wasn't sure what to say, wasn't even sure what to feel. Before he could ask another question, the man reached into the limousine and pulled out a box. It was neatly wrapped in deep blue paper, the kind of wrapping Marcus had only ever seen in fancy department stores. "This is for you," the man said, extending the box. Marcus hesitated, glancing from the gift to the man's face. "What is it?" he asked cautiously. The man simply nodded toward the box. "Open it." Marcus's fingers trembled slightly as he reached for the package. The paper was smooth beneath his hands, and he carefully peeled back the edges, his breath hitching as he lifted the lid. Inside was a winter jacket. But not just any jacket. It was thick, high quality, built for the harshest cold. The kind of jacket that could make even the brutal Detroit winters bearable. Marcus stared at it, unable to believe what he was seeing. The fabric was heavy, the lining soft. He brushed his fingers over the material, feeling the warmth it promised. It was a far cry from the thin, worn jacket he had given away the night before. This is for me?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The man nodded. "He wanted to make sure you were taken care of after what you did for him." Marcus swallowed hard, his throat tightening with emotion. He had never owned anything this nice, never even dreamed of it. For a moment he didn't know what to do, didn't know how to process what was happening. Then, slowly, he pulled the jacket from the box and slipped it on. Warmth wrapped around him instantly, sinking into his skin like a deep exhale. The sleeves fit perfectly. The weight of the fabric settled on his shoulders like a protective shield against the cold. It was more than just a jacket. It was proof that his kindness had meant something. Proof that someone had seen him, truly seen him, and had cared enough to give back. Marcus clenched his jaw, trying to push back the sting of tears in his eyes. "Tell him," he swallowed hard, looking up at the suited man. "Tell him thank you, that I'm glad he's okay." The man smiled, his eyes glinting with something close to admiration. "I will." He reached into his coat and pulled out a small card, handing it to Marcus. "If you ever need anything, don't hesitate to ask. You have friends now, Marcus, people who care." Marcus took the card, nodding, though he wasn't sure what to say. The man stepped back, opening the limousine door. "Take care, Marcus." With that, he slid back into the car and the door closed with a quiet click. Marcus stood there, watching as the limousine pulled away, its tires rolling smoothly over the icy pavement. He stood in the cold, but for the first time in days, he didn't feel it. All he felt was warmth, and something deeper, hope. As he turned toward his apartment, the weight of the jacket settling around him, he realized something. This wasn't the end of the story. It was only the beginning. Marcus sat at the kitchen table, still wearing the new winter jacket. The warmth wrapped around him like a second skin, yet he wasn't sure if it was the thick lining or the weight of what had just happened that made his chest feel so full. His mom stood by the stove, arms crossed, eyeing him like she was waiting for an explanation. "A limo, Marcus?" she finally said. "A man in a suit? And this?" She gestured at the jacket, her voice tight with disbelief. "You want to tell me what's going on?" Marcus ran a hand over the fabric, still struggling to wrap his head around it himself. I don't know," he admitted. "I gave my jacket to a guy on the street last night, and now... this." His mom sighed, rubbing her forehead. "Baby, you've always had a good heart, but this..." A knock at the door interrupted her. Marcus's stomach flipped. He exchanged a glance with his mother before slowly pushing back his chair and walking toward the door. When he opened it, the same man in the suit from earlier stood there, his hands tucked neatly into his pockets. "Marcus," the man greeted, his expression warm but unreadable. "May I come in?" Marcus hesitated, looking back at his mom. She nodded warily, stepping aside to let the man enter. The suited man walked in smoothly, his presence almost out of place in their small, cozy apartment. He took a moment to glance around before turning his attention back to Marcus. "I imagine you have a lot of questions," he said. Marcus swallowed. "Yeah, you could say that." The man smiled slightly. "Let me start from the beginning." He took a measured breath before continuing. "The man you helped last night, he's not who you think he is." Marcus felt his pulse quicken. "He wasn't just a homeless man on the street," the man continued. "His name is Benjamin Whitmore." The name sent a jolt through Marcus. Even his mother let out a small gasp. Whitmore, as in Whitmore Industries, as in one of the wealthiest families in the state. The suited man, who Marcus now realized was likely some kind of assistant or advisor, watched their reactions carefully before continuing. For the last year, Mr. Whitmore has been conducting something of a social experiment, he explained. After experiencing personal losses, he wanted to understand the world differently. So, he chose to live on the streets for a time, without money, without resources, without any of the power his name carries. He wanted to see if people would still see him as a person, if kindness still existed. Marcus's throat went dry. Most people ignored him, the man continued, his voice steady, walked past him, pretended he didn't exist. He let out a slow breath. Until you. Silence stretched through the room. Marcus felt like the air had been sucked out of his lungs. He thought back to that moment on the street, the way Benjamin had shivered, his lips turning blue, the way his hollow eyes met Marcus's, pleading for warmth. It had been real. Marcus had seen him not as a billionaire or an experiment, just as a human being. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. Then the suited man stepped aside, and from the hallway, a familiar voice spoke. "Hello, Marcus." Marcus's breath caught as Benjamin Whitmore stepped into view. But this wasn't the same man he had met in the alley. He was clean-shaven now, his once frail frame now wrapped in a crisp, tailored overcoat. His hands were steady, no longer trembling from the cold. But the eyes, the deep, thoughtful eyes, were the same. Marcus just stared. "You," Benjamin nodded, offering a small smile. "It's me." Marcus swallowed hard. You're okay." Benjamin stepped closer, warmth and sincerity in his gaze. "Because of you." The weight of the words settled in Marcus's chest like a heavy stone. He shook his head. "I just gave you my jacket, that's all." Benjamin chuckled, shaking his head. "No, son. You gave me hope." The room was silent again, but this time it felt different. "I spent months on the streets," Benjamin continued, his voice softer now. "People avoided me, pretended not to see me, and in those moments I started to wonder." His gaze turned distant for a moment before he refocused on Marcus. Was kindness still real? Did people still care? He smiled. "And then you came along." Marcus felt his chest tighten. "You had nothing to spare, and yet you gave, without hesitation." Benjamin's voice was filled with quiet emotion. "I needed that jacket, yes, but more than that, I needed to know that someone still saw me as a person." Marcus's mother, who had been silent until now, wiped at her eyes, clearly overwhelmed. Benjamin turned toward her. "Miss Carter, you raised an extraordinary son." Her lips parted, but no words came. She only nodded, blinking quickly. Then Benjamin turned back to Marcus. "I want to show you something," he said. "Both of you." Marcus's brows furrowed. "What do you mean?" Benjamin smiled, then gestured toward the still open doorway. "Come with me. I promise. It'll be worth your time." Marcus exchanged a look with his mother, whose expression was still a mix of shock and disbelief. "You don't have to do anything," Benjamin assured them. "But I'd like to take you somewhere. Explain everything properly." Marcus hesitated. This whole thing felt unreal. But then he remembered the man he had met in the alley, the one he had given his jacket to, not because he was wealthy, but because he was freezing. Because he was human. He took a slow breath, then nodded. "Okay." His mother hesitated a moment longer, but then she exhaled and grabbed her coat. "Let's go." Benjamin's smile widened. "Good." As they stepped out into the cold night, the limo door swung open, waiting for them. "Ready, force them." Marcus still didn't know what was happening, but somehow he knew. This night was about to change everything. The limousine hummed softly as it glided through the quiet Detroit streets, the city lights flickering past the tinted windows. Marcus sat stiffly beside his mother, his fingers gripping the edge of his seat. Across from them, Benjamin Whitmore sat relaxed, his expression calm yet thoughtful. The weight of the night still clung to Marcus. An hour ago, he had believed he was helping just another homeless man. Now, he was sitting in a luxury car with one of the wealthiest men in the city, heading toward some unknown destination. His mom, sitting beside him, still hadn't fully recovered from the shock. She kept glancing at Benjamin, then back at Marcus, her lips pressed into a tight line, as if afraid that speaking would make this all disappear. Finally, Marcus broke the silence. "Where are we going?" Benjamin smiled, his eyes warm. "You'll see soon enough." The limo made a slow turn onto a quieter street, where old brick buildings lined the sidewalks. The streetlights flickered, casting long shadows, and Marcus could already tell this wasn't the kind of neighborhood where limousines usually stopped. After a few more blocks, the car pulled up in front of a 3-story building with a faded sign above the entrance. Community Outreach Center. Marcus frowned. The building looked worn, a little neglected, but there was life inside. Through the large windows, he could see the soft glow of overhead lights, children playing in one room, a group of volunteers stacking food in another. Benjamin noticed Marcus's gaze and smiled. "Come on," he said, opening the door and stepping out. Marcus and his mother followed, stepping onto the cold pavement. The air was crisp, but the jacket Benjamin had given him kept him warm. Benjamin led them toward the entrance, where a woman in a thick sweater and gloves was waiting. She was middle-aged, with kind eyes and a warm smile. "Marcus, Ms. Carter, this is Evelyn Thompson, the coordinator of the center." Evelyn extended her hand. "It's so good to finally meet you," she said. Marcus shook her hand, still confused. You know who I am?" Evelyn chuckled. "Of course. We've all heard about you." His mom glanced between them, still wary. "He's just a kid," she said. "I don't understand why we're here." Benjamin's expression softened. "Because Marcus's kindness set something in motion. And I want you both to see what happens when people choose to care." He pushed open the door, and the warmth of the center rushed over them. Inside, the walls were lined with colorful drawings and inspirational quotes. Children sat at long tables, working on crafts, laughing, talking. A few older kids played board games in a corner, and volunteers bustled around preparing meals. The whole place buzzed with life. "This center," Benjamin said, looking around, "has been a safe haven for families in need for years. It offers meals, after-school programs, and a place for people to come when they have nowhere else to go." Marcus took it all in. It was a world he hadn't realized existed just a few streets away from his own home. "But," Benjamin continued, his voice quieter, "it's been struggling. The funding was running out. They were weeks away from closing their doors for good." Marcus turned to look at him. "And now?" Benjamin smiled. "Now, thanks to you, that won't happen." Marcus blinked. "What do you mean?" Benjamin sighed, rubbing his hands together as if gathering his thoughts. "A long time ago, I lost everything," he admitted. "Before I had my wealth, before I built my company, I knew what it felt like to struggle." Marcus frowned, surprised. "You were homeless before?" Benjamin nodded. "Not in the way I was recently, but yes, I came from nothing. And when you grow up that way, you never really forget it." He glanced around the center, his expression distant. "That's why I started supporting places like this. But somewhere along the way, I got disconnected. I stopped seeing the people, only the numbers." He turned back to Marcus, his eyes steady. "And then, I met you." Marcus's throat tightened. "When you gave me your jacket," Benjamin said, "you didn't know who I was. You didn't expect anything in return. You just saw a person who needed help, and you helped." He exhaled, and that reminded me why places like this matter. Why people matter. Marcus felt his mother's hand on his back, steadying him as Benjamin continued. "So," Benjamin said, gesturing to Evelyn, "I've made sure this center will never have to worry about funding again." Evelyn's eyes glistened as she nodded. "He donated enough to keep us running for years. We can expand our programs, help more families, and give kids a safe space to grow." Marcus's heart pounded. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. Benjamin turned back to him. "And it's all because of you." His mom wiped at her eyes, shaking her head. "This is unbelievable." Benjamin smiled gently. "Kindness has a ripple effect, Ms. Carter. Your son started one." Marcus swallowed hard, overwhelmed. He had thought he was just one person, just a kid trying to do the right thing. But now he was standing in a room full of people whose lives would be different because of one small choice. Evelyn stepped forward, placing a hand on Marcus's shoulder. "Would you like to meet some of the kids?" Marcus nodded, still feeling like he was dreaming. As they walked through the center, kids ran up to Evelyn, showing off their drawings or asking for snacks. Some of them glanced curiously at Marcus, sensing he was someone important, but not knowing why. He spotted a small boy, no older than 7, sitting quietly with a book. His clothes were a little too big for him, his shoes scuffed. Marcus hesitated, then walked over and sat down beside him. "Hey," he said. The boy looked up with cautious eyes. "What are you reading?" Marcus asked. The boy held up the book, a well-worn copy of Where the Wild Things Are. "That's a good one," Marcus said, smiling. "I used to love that book." The boy's expression softened slightly. "Really?" "Yeah. You know the best part?" The boy shook his head. Marcus grinned. "The monsters aren't so scary when you realize they just want to be understood." The boy considered this, then nodded. "I think so too." For a moment, Marcus forgot about the limo, the money, the life-changing events of the past 24 hours. Right now, he was just a kid, sitting with another kid, sharing a moment of understanding. And somehow that felt like the most important thing in the world. As the night went on, Marcus watched his mother talking to Evelyn, watched Benjamin smiling as he observed the center. This was what mattered. Not wealth, not status, but people. And he realized something. He wanted to be part of this, to help, to give back. Maybe, just maybe, this was what he was meant to do. And for the first time in a long time, Marcus felt something new bloom in his chest. Hope. The hum of conversation filled the community center, but for Marcus, the world had shrunk down to this moment. The realization that one small act of kindness had changed everything. His mother stood beside him, her hands clasped together, her face still painted with disbelief. Evelyn Thompson was speaking with some volunteers, and Benjamin Whitmore stood just a few feet away, watching Marcus with an expression of quiet satisfaction. Marcus felt like he had stepped into a story that wasn't his own. And yet, here he was. Benjamin took a slow step forward and reached into the inner pocket of his coat. "There's one more thing," he said, his voice steady but gentle. He pulled out a thick white envelope and extended it toward Marcus's mother. "This is for you," he said simply. Marcus's mother hesitated. She didn't reach for it. Her eyes flickered between Benjamin's face and the envelope, wariness creeping into her expression. What is this?" Benjamin's smile softened. "Consider it a little help, a way to make things easier for you and Marcus." She shook her head, taking a step back. "Mr. Whitmore, Benjamin's gaze remained steady. "Ms. Carter, I know what it's like to struggle. I know what it means to stretch every dollar, to wonder how you'll make rent or keep food on the table." His voice was calm, but there was something deeply personal beneath it. something that made Marcus's chest tighten. "This isn't charity," Benjamin continued. "This is a thank you. And a reminder that sometimes the people who give the most deserve to receive too." Marcus swallowed hard. His mother's fingers trembled as she slowly reached out and took the envelope. Her breath hitched as she peeled back the flap and caught a glimpse of what was inside. Her hands pressed against her mouth. Tears filled her eyes. "Mr. Whitmore," she whispered. Marcus peered over her shoulder and saw thick stacks of cash, more money than he had ever seen in one place, enough to make a real difference, enough to wipe away months, even years of worry. Tears slipped silently down his mother's cheeks. "I don't know what to say." Benjamin smiled softly. "You don't have to say anything." Her shoulders shook, and for the first time in a long time, Marcus saw something in her face he hadn't seen in years. Relief. She pressed the envelope to her chest, her voice breaking as she whispered, "Thank you." Benjamin nodded, his gaze full of warmth. "You raised an incredible young man, Miss Carter. This is the least I can do." Marcus felt his throat tighten. He had spent so many nights lying awake, listening to his mom sigh as she sorted through overdue bills. He had seen the exhaustion in her eyes when she came home from work, the way she tried to smile even when everything felt like it was crumbling around them. And now for the first time, she wouldn't have to carry that weight alone. But Benjamin wasn't done yet. He turned back to Marcus, slipping his hand into his pocket once more. "And as for you," he said, his voice quieter now, more personal. Marcus watched as Benjamin pulled out a small, elegant box. He held it for a moment, as if weighing something important, before finally handing it to Marcus. Curious, Marcus took it and carefully lifted the lid. Inside, nestled in soft velvet, was a watch. But not just any watch. It was old, yet pristine, crafted with a timeless design, the kind of heirloom that carried history in every delicate detail, the kind of watch that belonged to a man with stories to tell. Marcus's fingers hovered over it. "What is this?" Benjamin's voice was softer now. "It belonged to my father." Marcus's head snapped up in surprise. Benjamin's gaze was distant, his smile tinged with something bittersweet. He used to say that time was the most precious thing we had, that how we use it, how we spend it on others, is what defines us. He exhaled slowly. "I want you to have it, Marcus." Marcus's heart pounded. I can't take this," he stammered. "It's too much." Benjamin shook his head. "No, son. It's just enough." Marcus swallowed the lump in his throat. He traced the smooth edges of the watch, feeling the weight of it in his hands. This wasn't just a gift. This was trust. This was legacy. This was a reminder that time, more than money, more than anything, was meant to be given to others. His fingers trembled as he slipped the watch onto his wrist. It fit perfectly. He looked up at Benjamin, his voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you." Benjamin smiled. "You earned it." For a moment, the room felt smaller, the noise of the center fading into the background. It was just them. The boy who had given all he had, and the man who had been changed because of it. But then, Benjamin straightened, his voice growing lighter. "There's one last thing I'd like to ask." Marcus lifted his head, waiting. Benjamin glanced around the community center, watching the children, the volunteers, the life that filled the space. "I want to start something here," he said. "A program. One that helps kids who are struggling, who need support, who need to know that someone cares." He turned back to Marcus. "And I want you to help me build it." Marcus's breath caught. "Me?" Benjamin nodded. "You have something rare, Marcus. A heart that sees people, not just problems. That's what this center needs. That's what the world needs." Marcus stared at him. A week ago, he was just another kid trying to survive, trying to help his mom, trying to keep his head above water. And now he was being asked to be part of something bigger than himself, to make a difference, to use his time, his most precious resource, to help others. He glanced at his mom. She nodded, her eyes full of pride. Marcus looked back at Benjamin, his chest tightening with something new. Purpose. "I'd love to," he said, his voice steady. Benjamin's smile widened. "Then we start tomorrow." Marcus looked down at the watch on his wrist. For the first time, he understood exactly what it meant. Time wasn't just about minutes and hours. It was about moments. And he was ready to make every single one count. Marcus had never imagined that a single act of kindness could change the course of his life. But as he stepped into the community center after school, wearing the same warm jacket Benjamin had given him, he knew things were different now. The center bustled with energy, kids laughing, volunteers setting up tables, warm meals being served in the kitchen. It was a place filled with hope. And now, Marcus was part of it. "Hey, Marcus!" Evelyn Thompson called from the front desk, her face lighting up as he walked in. "Glad you're here," Marcus nodded, setting his backpack down. "Wouldn't miss it." The first thing on his schedule, organizing an after-school activity for the younger kids. He had never been the type to stand in front of a group and lead anything. But today, as he gathered the children in a circle, their eager faces looking up at him, he realized this felt right. "All right," he said, rubbing his hands together. "Who's ready to make some art?" A cheer went up. Within minutes, the kids were at the tables, drawing, painting, and crafting with whatever supplies they could find. Marcus moved between them, offering encouragement, laughing at their silly stories, and, more than anything, just being present. That was what they needed most. Someone to see them, someone to remind them they mattered. And Marcus understood that now, better than ever. Halfway through the session, Marcus heard a familiar voice behind him. "Yo, Marcus!" He turned to see Ryan and Sophie standing in the doorway, bundled in their winter coats. Ryan smirked. "We figured if you're going to be a big-shot mentor, you might need some backup." Sophie smiled, holding up a box of school supplies. "Thought the kids could use these," Marcus grinned. "You guys are the best." Ryan nudged his shoulder. Yeah. Just don't make me do math homework, man." Sophie rolled her eyes. "Ryan, you need help with math." Ryan shrugged. "That's why I'm here. Maybe the kids will teach me something." Marcus chuckled, shaking his head. "All right, come on." With their help, the afternoon flew by. Sophie worked with a few younger kids on reading assignments, and Ryan, despite his complaints, ended up showing a group of students how to build paper airplanes. Watching them, Marcus felt a warmth deeper than any jacket could provide. His kindness had started something, and now his friends were carrying it forward. The next morning, as Marcus walked through the school hallways, something felt different. People nodded at him, smiled. Some even stopped him just to say hey. He wasn't invisible anymore. Lisa, a girl from his English class, stopped him at his locker. "Hey, Marcus," she said, tucking her hair behind her ear. "I saw the post about what you've been doing at the community center. That's really cool." Marcus shrugged, feeling a little embarrassed. "It's nothing big. Just helping out." She shook her head. "No, it is big. I think a lot of us could learn something from you." Before Marcus could respond, Ryan appeared, draping an arm over his shoulder. "Look at you, man. School hero." "Cut it out," Marcus muttered, shoving Ryan's arm off. Ryan laughed. "Nah, seriously. You've got people talking. And for once, it's not about dumb stuff. It's about good stuff." Marcus felt his face warm. He had never cared much about what people at school thought of him. But knowing that his actions were making an impact, it felt good. Maybe this was what leadership looked like. Not being the loudest person in the room, not demanding attention, but showing up, doing the right thing when no one's watching, and inspiring others to do the same. Over the next few weeks, Marcus fell into a routine: school during the day, community center in the afternoon. It wasn't easy. There were still days when he was exhausted, when balancing homework and volunteering felt overwhelming. But every time he saw the smiles on the kids' faces, the way they ran up to him, excited to share what they had learned, he knew it was worth it. And the center was thriving. With Benjamin's donation, they had expanded their programs. Hot meals were served every evening, ensuring no child went to bed hungry. Tutoring sessions were available for kids struggling in school. Job support workshops helped parents and young adults get back on their feet. And the mentorship program, the one Benjamin had asked Marcus to help build, was becoming the heart of it all. Kids were paired with mentors who could guide them, support them, and remind them that they weren't alone. Marcus sat in on some of the sessions, watching older students help the younger ones, watching friendships form, watching confidence grow. One afternoon, as he helped a little boy named Elijah with his spelling homework, Evelyn Thompson approached with a proud smile. "You're a natural, Marcus," she said. Marcus laughed. "I don't know about that." Evelyn shook her head. "No, really. The kids look up to you. They trust you." Marcus looked around the center, at the laughter, the warmth, the sense of home that filled the space. "I just want them to know they matter," he said quietly. Evelyn nodded. "And that's exactly why you belong here." Marcus swallowed past the lump in his throat. He had never felt like he belonged anywhere before. But here, he did. That evening, as Marcus walked home, the cold Detroit air brushed against his face. But this time, he barely felt it. He had spent so many years thinking survival was all there was, making it through each day, doing what he could to help his mom, never expecting anything more. Now, for the first time, he saw a future, not just for himself, but for the kids at the center, for his community, for the people who needed someone to see them, just like he had seen Benjamin that night in the alley. As he turned onto his street, he glanced at the watch on his wrist, the one Benjamin had given him. A reminder. Time was precious, and he was going to spend it wisely, not just existing, but making a difference, for himself, for others, for the future. Because kindness doesn't just change one life, it changes everything. The biting chill of Detroit's winter nipped at Marcus's skin as he walked down Main Street, his breath visible in the air. Snow dusted the sidewalks, the streetlights flickering against the icy pavement. It had been weeks since his life had changed, since he had given away his only jacket to a man he thought was just another homeless stranger. Weeks since he had learned that one small act of kindness could change everything. Now, he was no longer just a kid struggling to get by. He was part of something bigger. He had purpose. And yet, some things hadn't changed. The cold was still merciless. The city was still filled with people trying to survive. And on this particular night, Marcus noticed someone familiar, not in identity, but in circumstance. A man sat hunched on a bench near an old storefront, his arms wrapped tightly around himself. His coat was thin, not nearly enough to protect against the bitter cold. His face was turned downward, but Marcus could see the way his hands trembled, how his breath came out in uneven clouds. Marcus stopped in his tracks. For a moment, it was as if he had been transported back in time. To that night. To that moment when he had seen Benjamin Whitmore for the first time, shivering against a brick wall. Marcus's fingers brushed against the scarf wrapped around his neck, the thick, warm one Ryan had given him. He didn't hesitate. Taking a deep breath, Marcus stepped forward. "Hey, sir," he said, his voice gentle. The man looked up, his eyes wary. There was exhaustion in them, a quiet sort of desperation. Marcus knew that look. He had seen it before. Without a word, Marcus unwound the scarf from around his neck and draped it carefully over the man's shoulders. The man blinked in surprise, his mouth opening as if to protest. "You need it more than I do," Marcus said simply. The man stared at him for a long moment. His lips parted, but no words came out. Instead, his eyes glistened, and he gave a small nod, his fingers clutching the scarf tightly. A lump formed in Marcus's throat. This was how it started. One small choice. One moment of kindness. It didn't take much to change someone's life. Marcus knew that now. And he also knew that somewhere, maybe just weeks or months from now, this man would remember this moment. Maybe, just maybe, he would pass that kindness on. Marcus smiled. "Stay warm, okay?" The man nodded again, pulling the scarf closer. As Marcus turned to walk away, a familiar voice spoke from nearby. "That," the voice said, "is how you change the world." Marcus turned to see Benjamin Whitmore leaning against a lamppost, watching with a knowing smile. The older man was no longer the shivering stranger Marcus had first met in the alley. He was strong again, dressed in a sleek winter coat, his presence commanding yet warm. He had come a long way, and so had Marcus. Marcus shrugged, smiling slightly. "It just felt like the right thing to do," Benjamin nodded, his eyes full of approval. "That's how it starts, you know." Marcus tilted his head. "How what starts?" Benjamin stepped forward, placing a hand on Marcus's shoulder. "A ripple." Marcus let those words sink in. One act of kindness, one moment of generosity, one choice to see someone, to acknowledge them, to remind them that they mattered. It could spread. It could change things. It had already changed him. Marcus looked down at the watch on his wrist, the weight of it grounding him, reminding him of everything he had learned. He thought of the community center, the kids who now had a place to feel safe. He thought of his mother, the way she had cried with relief when she realized their struggles had eased. He thought of Sophie and Ryan, how they had joined him in making a difference. And he thought of himself, not just as a boy who had once given away his only jacket, but as someone who now understood what it meant to give. A warm sense of purpose filled his chest. He met Benjamin's gaze and smiled. "I think I get it now." Benjamin's expression softened. "I knew you would." The two of them stood there for a moment, the city buzzing around them, the cold biting at the air. But Marcus didn't feel the chill anymore. Because kindness was warmth. And for the first time in his life, he understood that he was part of something bigger. Not just a moment. Not just a story. A movement. A ripple effect that would never stop. And it had all started with a jacket. With a choice. With a boy who had decided to care. Marcus took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment. Then, with one last glance at the man on the bench, who was now sitting just a little bit taller, just a little less lost, Marcus turned and walked forward. And this time, he knew exactly where he was going.